Dr. Leonard Lauf works as the medical director at the International Fertility Research Program in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. He leads a quiet life with his wife and daughter, but he also lives with the ghastly memories of a night almost 21 years ago when he played a part in a drama of the high seas.
With the impact, I just skidded right across the entire ballroom floor in my chair, grabbed hold of the door jambs to prevent myself from literally going down the steps, and in the corner I watched the bass fiddle of the band flip up into the air and do a somersault, and you realize that a great catastrophe had occurred.
Tonight we'll be talking further to Leonard Lauf about that night and to others throughout America who have survived Holocaust and horror at sea. People who have come through fire and explosion, witnessed intrigue and incompetence. All are united by a common bond, for they survived when havoc struck. Dr. Lauf was traveling to Scandinavia to study pelvic cancer and was on board the Swedish liner Stockholm for the 5-day crossing. In 1956, many liners were still plying the seas. Indeed, no self-respecting nation was without its flagship. And in 1951, Italy had joined the big league with the Andrea Doria. Her appearance, from all angles, was superb. On the night of July the 25th, 1956, the Andrea Doria and the Stockholm, with Dr. Lauf on board, were approaching the Nantucket lightship when the Swedish liner plunged into the side of the Andrea Doria like a dagger, mortally wounding her. For the passengers asleep in their cabins in direct line of the collision, there was little chance of survival. 43 died that night.
We were fortunate in that there was another American physician aboard, and he volunteered to go up to the dining room, which we used as a screening area for all of this mass of passengers that were coming over from the Andrea Doria. Now, as I recall, I think something like 3, 6, or 12 of the crew was literally washed to sea with a collision. The rest of the men were literally driven. Their feet and legs were driven into the steel bulkheads by the impact. And so what we saw were tremendous compound comminuted fractures of the lower legs in these people. There were some fairly nasty lacerations, and one in particular that I do remember is one of the crew had literally an enucleation of his eye. The eyeball was literally hanging on his cheek. And these were pretty traumatic events.
The fact is that even after such a blow from the Stockholm, a modern liner like the Andrea Doria should have stayed afloat. The controversy over why she didn't still rages today. At 10:09, the Andrea Doria rolled over and sank. Thus ended the last chapter in the long quest for safety at sea. Within a few years, the jumbo jet was to empty the luxurious salons of the few great remaining passenger liners. So let's examine the record of these great days of sea travel, the ships and the men who sailed in them. The launch of the Queen Mary, amidst great national pride and rejoicing, marked the high point of a wonderful era of transatlantic ocean travel. Today, she stands here in her own private harbor at Long Beach, a monument to those grand days. You know, in a cabin such as this, the rich traveler was pampered with every conceivable luxury, including air conditioning. Now, how about that, huh? This is the Queen Mary King George suite, and it would have cost you at least $5,000 for the 5-day crossing. Today, it's a floating hotel. Everybody wanted to travel on the biggest and the most luxurious ships, and the competition between the lines was tremendous. However, in 1911 came the ultimate in ocean travel when the unsinkable Titanic was launched. In those days, the public had few heroes. The media had yet to create them. There were no football heroes, pop stars, no astronauts. Instead, the heroes of the day were the one group most people admired and envied, the very rich. The jet set of the day, if one may call them that, spent their winters in San Moritz and their summers in Monte Carlo. So the maiden voyage of the most luxurious liner ever built was a natural addition to the social calendar, and their needs were well catered to. When the Titanic left Southampton on her maiden voyage in April 1912, she carried 800 cases of shelled walnuts, 15,000 bottles of ale, 5 grand pianos, 30,000 eggs, and enough lifeboats to satisfy the regulations, but only enough for less than half those aboard. 5 days out of Southampton, she struck an iceberg and sank. The loss of the Titanic shocked the world. The confidence of the great shipbuilders and shipping lines was shattered in just 4 devastating hours. The sinking of the RMS Titanic has become a legend. But what has become of those few passengers still alive who remember that icy night 65 years ago? Frank Goldsmith is one of the few still alive. He lives in Lexington, Ohio.
My exact age was 9 years and 4 months. Of course, Mother put me to bed that night about 8:30, which was the usual thing. And I stayed fast asleep until around 1 o'clock. An officer came to our door, rapped it, and opened. It was open, and he walked in and said, "Do you have life preservers? If so, you'd better put them on because you may have to go out in a lifeboat."
There were 3 classes of passengers on the Titanic that night, and to reach the lifeboats, the 2nd and 3rd class passengers had to make their way up to the 1st class decks. Whether or not those from the lower decks were actually prevented from reaching the boats, we shall never know. But the statistics speak for themselves. More than half the 1st class passengers survived, only a quarter of those traveling steerage. This was the class system at its most hideous. The rich believed they had the right to live while the other passengers could be left to sink with the ship. As the Titanic's list increased, husbands and wives said their final farewells.
And then there was a gateway through which only the women and children were being permitted to pass. And so I saw Dad and Mother kiss and hug each other. And I saw Tom Theobald take his ring off his finger and say to Mother, "If I don't see you in New York, will you see that my wife gets this?" And of course, Mother promised that. Then Mother and I, of course, and Dad and Tom were separated at that point. But young Alfred Rush, Mother saw, wasn't alongside of her. "No," he says, "I'm a man now. I'm not going with you." And you see, he'd become 16 on April 14th. And he wasn't going to be treated as a child at the age of 16. And so, of course, he also died.
However, the Titanic legend was born on the rear of the boat deck where the band played ragtime to keep the passengers calm. Offered a place in the boats, they preferred to go down with the ship, playing the haunting hymn Autumn to comfort those still on deck preparing to meet their God as the 46,000-ton Titanic, the unsinkable pride of the fleet, plunged into the icy depths, taking with her 1,503 men, women, and children.
All of a sudden, some of the ladies began to call out, "Oh, it's going to float." And so Mother released me, and I looked quickly where I had been looking before, and there the tail end of the ship was aimed straight at the sky, and it just hung there for several minutes. And then, of course, it slowly went down.
As a result of the Titanic disaster, the government lifeboat regulations were completely revised so that all ships carried enough lifeboats for every passenger and more. In future, a 24-hour radio watch would be maintained on all the ships at sea, and the route to Europe was moved further south, away from the ice floes.
So far, we've examined tragedies that happened far from civilization in the dead of night. But in 1915, a boat disaster of equally enormous proportion was to strike at the heart of one of America's greatest cities in broad daylight. July 24th in Chicago, the beginning of a summer weekend with the kids home from school and beautiful Lake Michigan beckoning the holidaymakers. The 9,000 staff and families of the Western Electric Company were eagerly boarding the 4 ships tied up at Clark Street en route to their annual picnic. The favorite was the Eastland, a tall, sleek 3-decker known for her speed, but also as the a temperamental ship of the lakes. There were fully 2,500 vacationers on board when Captain Pedersen noticed her listing to starboard. His orders were to fill the port ballast tanks, but not too much. There was precious little ballast anyway, and the Eastland had a bad reputation for keeping her trim. Jack Billows was working on the excursion steamer directly behind the Eastland.
I was in the ship, the Theodore Roosevelt over there, crossed the bridge, across the river. The Eastland was docked right here, ready to go out. When she pulled away from the dock, she just keeled over on this side and covered about half of the river.
A mass of happy humanity was transformed into a struggling, screaming chaos of desperate bodies. Many died instantly, crushed in the wreckage. Some slowly trapped and suffocated. Others drowned, sucked down into the depths of the Chicago River.
We started rescue. We really couldn't use the lifeboat for doing it. We just floated in it and grabbed anything we saw floating. There was a body, we grabbed it. Life or dead, we grabbed it. We couldn't use oars, traffic, and everything was floating around. You could have walked across the river or what was floating. Young children being held by their dead mothers, or dead children and dead mothers together. That was the most tragic thing. Then I saw whole families praying, kissing their rosary. You could say they were frozen, stiff. You couldn't do anything.
In all, the official toll was 815. But in the confusion, it is more likely that 1,100 people perished.
They kept that figure below to save their neck for overloading the ship.
The cartoonists captured the outrage and anger of a nation, while the headlines told their own harassing stories. So why did the Eastland capsize? Was the legal limit of 2,500 passengers in fact far too many? Were there in any case more than this number on board? As she was preparing to leave, did the pilot tug take the strain too early and pull her over? Or had her basic design made her top-heavy anyway? Was the water level in the river dangerously low? Or had too much ballast water been pumped out, making her dependent on her landlines to hold her upright? All these questions had to be answered. And as the casualties mounted, wholesale arrests were ordered. The court convened in the outraged atmosphere of 1915 was still sitting 20 years later. Finally, the case was thrown out in August 1935. No blame was apportioned, and none of the bereaved or those maimed by the Eastland received a penny in compensation. We shall officially never know who was to blame.
Tragic that words can't describe, because it was not a war, it was not an earthquake that God had control over. It was just a man-made carelessness.
The Eastland was quite simply the most shocking maritime disaster since the Titanic, though the carnage taking place on the battlefields of Europe soon ousted it from the headlines. Today, the Eastland is barely remembered. By 1917, the war in Europe preoccupied everyone. The New World was hurrying to the rescue of the Old. Supplies of all sorts were ferried across the Atlantic, and so it was that the French freighter Mont Blanc left New York with a vital cargo of ammunition. She was loaded with 2,300 tons of pictic acid, 200 tons of TNT, 35 tons of petrol, and 10 tons of gun cotton. There couldn't have been a more lethal cargo. On December the 6th, she was approaching the narrows of Halifax Harbor. At the same time, the Belgian relief ship Emo, seaward bound, was weaving her way through the many tugs working in the harbor. Shortly after 9 a.m., they collided in the inner harbor. The ammunition ship Mont Blanc caught fire immediately. The fuse had been lit to the floating bomb. Bill and Betty Kidd were at school at the time.
I'll tell you, it was a morning, well, it was really a beautiful morning, you know, it's sunshine, you know, really almost, although it was in December, it was almost like a summer's day. We were all, the boys' room, the cap room, we were all standing by the window. Somebody said, God, there must be a ship or something on fire in the Narrows. And no sooner got the words out of her mouth, and all hell let go. And it just seemed like the end of the world had came. All we could hear was timbers falling and, you know, stairways letting go, glass flying all around.
The force of the explosion parted the waters of the harbor, blew the Emo bodily onto the shore, wiped out an entire hill of buildings, and sent the anchor of the Mont Blanc flying for 3 miles. A fragment of it is still there today, just where it landed. And so Halifax, minutes before, complacent in the belief that it was too far away from the war to be damaged, was brought to its knees in a few seconds.
The whole back section of the house was gone. It had all come in, and that's where Mother was getting dressed at the time. Everything came in. So when they run around looking for her, nobody thought to look underneath the debris for her. I think Mother was there 3 days before they did anything for her. They thought she was, you know, dead or dying anyway. Well, her teeth had been driven down her throat, and her face was tore up terribly. Her face was all, you know, ripped and torn from where she had been facing the glass, and she got the full effects of the window right in the face. And so why she wasn't blinded, I don't know.
Many people blamed the Germans. One man reported seeing a Zeppelin over the city. Another claimed he had seen the German fleet bombarding the town. After a few hours, the smoke cleared, leaving 25,000 people without any form of shelter, 10,000 injured, 199 blinded, and an estimated 3,200 dead. One of the most harrowing stories concerns a young officer in the Royal Flying Corps who, on hearing of the disaster, was granted compassionate leave. He hurriedly returned to Halifax to find his house destroyed, and then had to identify the bodies of his mother, his 3 brothers, his 2 sisters, his wife, and his 2 younger children. He was told that his 3rd child was missing, presumed dead. Not far away, she lay unconscious and unidentified. Unknown to her father, later she would recover. But he buried his family and went away from Halifax. She never saw him again. The Halifax explosion killed more people that day than any air raid during the London Blitz. The cargo of death intended for use against the Germans had instead struck mortally at her enemies. Now, this explosion was not to be equaled in force until Hiroshima, nearly 30 years later. The rejoicing that followed the release from 4 long years of war was short-lived. The 20s gave way to the 30s and the Depression. And so it was that in 1934, 2 young girls saved up for a luxury cruise to get away from it all. They chose the liner Morro Castle, which sailed between New York and Havana.
That was Sloppy Joe's. That was the bar, the in place for many, many years until Castro came to Cuba.
Bob Smith was the cruise director.
We met him, I think we met him that very first night. And it was a mutual attraction, you know, and we were together practically the whole trip.
Unknown to them, a drama was gathering pace on board. At 6:45 p.m., the captain was discovered dead in his cabin. The cause of his death was never to be discovered. The Prince girls heard the news from Bob Smith.
We had the doctor there, and the doctor was giving us his idea of what might have killed the captain and so forth, and speculating on who the new captain was going to be, because we sailed the next day at 4 o'clock.
And finally, we retired and started packing.
So I said, Ruthie, I smell smoke. And I quickly went to the phone, called the operator, and said, I smelled smoke. The operator said, yes, I know, there's a fire on board.
I was called by my assistant about 3:15 in the morning, and the fire had already been burning for an hour, right outside my stateroom door.
There was no one to direct you or tell you where to go, what to do. No lifeboats were being launched. We just had to follow whatever direction we thought would bring us into a safe area.
Why had the fire spread through the ship, and how had it started in the first place? Amazingly, Captain Robert Wilmot had ordered the deck hydrants capped before the ship left Havana. He had turned off the smoke detector system to stop the smell of hides spreading to the passenger accommodations. And he had banned fire drills to avoid possible injury to passengers. Additionally, the new commander, Captain Worms, had headed the ship into the wind in a desperate attempt to reach the shelter of New York Harbor. And the wind had swept the fire the length of the ship.
Might have been that there was too much smoke and too much confusion. So the poor souls that I saw simply jumped into the ocean and into the sea, and that was it. In fact, at one time, when most of the people jumped off the ship on the aft end, the propellers were still going. And they simply jumped right down into the propellers.
Well, we got to a point where the flames were actually at our backs, and we could hear a priest giving absolution. People were crying. Ag said, I think the point has come where we'll have to jump.
They were hanging on an oar, and I swam up to them, and I grabbed the oar too because I was a little tired at that time, and the oar went down. Well, we couldn't hold the three of us, so I gave them a fight talk. I said, hold on to it, girls. There'll be some help here very shortly.
After 8 hours, the Prince sisters finally sighted a boat. Aboard was Jim Bogan.
They were very chipper and tried to help. I know they were kind of, well, maybe seasick after they got on the boat, and the fish and the other people on the boat sick.
Those are my most vivid memories. We were trapped in the aft part of the boat at one period. Well, I've often heard the expression, they died like rats, and this is what I was sure was going to happen to us.
The hero of the hour was George Rogers, the radio operator, who was reputed to have stayed at his post until the last minute. But disturbing facts were to emerge concerning his past. At the age of 13, he had been placed on probation and sent to a children's home for stealing. Later, he bought a radio shop. A mystery fire destroyed it. Then he joined the police department. His immediate senior was nearly killed by a letter bomb. His criminal record revealed his chief hobbies as chemistry. In particular, explosives and incendiary compounds. We shall never know how that fire started. As it was, the hero of the Morro Castle left behind him a dead captain, 135 dead passengers and crew, and the monarch of the Havana Run, a burnt-out wreck on the New Jersey shore. The captain of a modern ship can tell where he is to within a few feet at any time, day or night. And now, the introduction of specially launched navigational satellites has made the technology as sophisticated as it can be. So can accidents still happen? Yes. For there will always be the possibility of human error. The strict enforcement of comprehensive regulations is the only way to combat that possibility. These men aboard the cargo-carrying liner Santa Ana in San Francisco, about to set off on a luxury cruise of South America, go through their life drill with a sense of purpose, perhaps remembering some of the disasters we've seen tonight.
The chronicle of tragedy is a long one. The Titanic, the Empress of Ireland, the Eastland, the Mont Blanc, the Andrea Doria, and the Morro Castle. But perhaps the greatest tragedy of all is that only after such disasters was action taken to avoid them. That so many had to die before safety procedures became a matter of course. Perhaps now, man at last respects the sea. It's sad that the price he's paid has been such a high one.